Kowalczyk.
Welcome. Welcome to the ARCO Forum and the third annual Harvard Colloquium on International Affairs. I'm Anne-Marie Slaughter. I'm the faculty director of the Harvard Colloquium on International Affairs. This is the only university-wide initiative to focus on every year on an issue of importance to the entire university and to the world. This year, our subject is globalization after September 11th. What's changed, or has anything changed? We have over 20 schools, centers, and programs participating. And in many ways, this colloquium demonstrates not only that Harvard is a place with multiple centers of excellence, but also that it can be more than the sum of its parts. That is exactly the agenda that President Summers has announced is part of what he wants to do as president. And without further ado, I will introduce the president to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, for everything that you have done in putting this colloquium together. It is a big contribution to the life of the university, and we are grateful to you. Thank you also to all the people who have worked with Anne-Marie and have helped her in putting together this colloquium, the panel sponsors, the moderators, and especially the students who worked on the colloquium. Thank you to the forum staff for this event. Thank you, Dean Nye, for making this forum available and for everything you have done for several decades now to promote the study of globalization and international affairs at the university. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend, Robert E. Rubin, of the Harvard class of 1960, and a number of subsequent affiliations. Secretary Rubin served as the director of the National Economic Council from 1993 to early 1995, and then as the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States from the beginning of 1995 until mid-1999. Now, different comparisons are made about different secretaries of the Treasury. it was quite commonly observed that by a number of people, perhaps notably by President Clinton, when Secretary Rubin was commented on, that Robert Rubin was the most outstanding Secretary of the Treasury since Alexander Hamilton. Subsequent to that, I became Secretary of the Treasury. And there were occasions on which people would begin, Lawrence Summers is the most outstanding Secretary of the Treasury since Robert Rubin. The Rubin era in U.S. and international economic policy saw the greatest boom in our country's history, the largest turnaround in our country's fiscal position, aggressive responses to contain financial crises abroad, and much else. But as much as Secretary Rubin was admired for these specific accomplishments, he was widely admired, and especially by those of us who had the privilege to work with him, for the way in which he functioned and served as a public servant. He put the country's interest, he put the government's interest, he put the colleagues with whom he worked interest always ahead of any interest of his own. He believed passionately that as important as any principle of policy or logic was the principle that the best decisions would always be reached through the most extensive consultation, the most careful thought, greatest rigor and care in the formulation of policy. His example of leadership was one that had an enormous influence on all who had the chance to work with him, and that demonstrated very clearly the benefits of doing things in the right way. I mentioned that Secretary Rubin was a graduate of the Harvard class of 1960. It gives me special pleasure to remark that he was actually a summa cum laude graduate of the Harvard class of 1960 with a major in economics. Bob Rubin was worrying about inflation in Latin America long before he became the Secretary of the Treasury. And Bob rejoins the Harvard community this summer as he has accepted an appointment as one of the 7 members of the Harvard Corporation. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Secretary Robert Rubin. Thank you all.
Thank you, Larry, for the very kind introduction. As I listened to Larry, it occurred to me he must want something. When he was deputy and I was secretary, he used to have to introduce me sometimes to speeches. And usually what he'd do is he'd get up and he would say, Bob Rubin's going to speak next. So finally I got up one day and I said to Larry, from now on, Larry, I'm drafting the introduction, you deliver it, and if that doesn't work, I'm going to both deliver the introduction and the speech. Anyway, thank you. The only question is what he wants, but in any event, thank you, Larry. Let me say that I am delighted to be with you all this evening. I do think this is a very important time to try to gauge the outlook for the years ahead and also try to gauge what makes most sense in terms of policy responses. I've spent my entire career dealing with uncertainty and trying to reduce that uncertainty to probabilities about future events that could then provide the basis for action. That is the essence of risk arbitrage, where I began my career and which in some measure shaped how I think about decision making. And that is what I did under Larry's tutelage at Treasury. In everything, that was Larry's view, not mine. In everything, I got the podium now. In everything from decisions on fiscal policy to the excruciatingly difficult judgments about massive loans to Mexico during the peso crisis. Applying that mindset to the world we live in, I believe that all times are complex and uncertain, but that some periods are especially so. And I have believed for several years this is one of those periods. An extremely well-known cabinet member in a former administration said to me when I went into government that you are too busy once you go into government, and so you live off your storehouse of intellectual capital. I found just the opposite, learning about matters that were new to me and seeing familiar matters in new ways. And much of this heightened my arbitrageur sense of the uncertainty and complexity of our time. The attack of September 11th, though a terrible personal tragedy for so many, didn't, in my opinion, change that complexity and uncertainty. But September 11th did increase public awareness in varying degrees about the threat of terrorism, the spread and simplification of weapons of mass destruction, global poverty, failed states, and much else, including, at least by implication, and most fundamentally, today's vastly tighter interconnection of our entire globe. September 11th has also provided at least the beginnings of broader participation in public debate about how to deal with all this. Thus, I think the answer to the question posed by this symposium is both no and yes. No in a fundamental sense, and yes in the increased recognition of the challenges we face and in some policy responses. I believe that our global society is at a critical juncture. Moving forward successfully requires a policy program that encompasses the globalization agenda, but also a parallel agenda to combat poverty and to broaden participation and growth. Moreover, I believe that such a program will only come from decision-making that recognizes the immense complexities and uncertainties around these issues, and from an effective political agenda, political strategy. Unfortunately, the public debate has been constrained in the media and even more in the political arena by an understandable, but I believe usually counterproductive hesitancy to criticize or even to raise questions about geopolitical policies and decisions. Reaching the best answers to the extraordinarily difficult questions of our times seems to me to require ways to support the commitment to combat terrorism and our military operations, while at the same time discussing and debating the critical questions of geopolitics in a spirit of true open-minded inquiry and with full recognition of their complexities and their ambiguity. Such debate, even in times of stress, is one of the great strengths of democracy. Arguably, had there been more such debates early on with respect to another very complex, though very different situation, the Vietnam War, perhaps the multiple tragedies of that war could have been far less. Also, let me quickly add, as an arbitrageur, that recognizing complexity and providing for open discussion does not mean lack of decisiveness or lack of commitment, but simply that the decisions will better reflect the complexities of reality. With that, let me now try to sketch out what I think is a sensible and useful framework for policy decisions on globalization, poverty, terrorism, and geopolitical instability, all of which to me seem inextricably intertwined. Looking back over the past several decades, the evidence seems overwhelming that on balance, reducing barriers to cross-border trade and capital flows, the spread of market-based economics, and rapid technological development have contributed greatly, though unevenly, to global and American economic well-being. However, these powerful forces of change have also created dislocations, social, economic, and cultural, for many people. They have also increased uncertainty because of the anxiety that accompanies change for even larger numbers of people who have done well, and they have created an increased likelihood of financial crisis, as evidenced in Mexico in 1995, in Asia and Russia, 1997, 1998. Moreover, these forces of change, so beneficial on balance, have not adequately addressed broad-based sharing of growth or poverty reduction, or other issues like environmental degradation that markets by their very nature will not optimally address. These adverse effects and inadequacies have led to an increasing public and political backlash against globalization and market-based economics, focused in large measure on the persistence of massive poverty and inequality, that poses a real threat that we will move backward rather than forward with respect to globalization and market-based economics. Now, the increased focus on terrorism adds to the debate around globalization. Poverty is seen to foment resentment, anger, hopelessness, and despair that can lead to terrorism, or, at least, to an environment that is supportive or hospitable to terrorism. And the question is raised of how globalization and market-based economics have affected poverty. Last year, I was a member of the United Nations Commission on Financing to Overcome Poverty, chaired by former President Zedillo of Mexico. In that context, I reviewed a broad array of articles on this question of the effect of globalization on poverty. And the answers put forth in those articles clearly depended on the perspective of the writer. On the one hand, the absolute number of people in poverty and the percentage of the global population in poverty has fallen. On the other hand, both are still vastly too high, and many people have either been left behind or even had their situations worsened. These issues of anti-globalization, terrorism, and poverty, all closely linked, are well known, but their significance, in my view, has not really taken hold. Because of what I do for a living, I read, or for the most part skim, Wall Street economic forecasts with some frequency, and I am struck by how little attention, if any, these reports pay to the backlash against globalization and market-based economics, and to geopolitical and terrorist risk, each of which could substantially undermine our short-term and long-term economic well-being. I was at a meeting yesterday with respect to economic forecasting with a group of forecasters from around the street, from around Wall Street, and after each one gave their judgment, I could not get them to factor in the probability that those judgments would be wrong because of terrorism and geopolitics. That suggests to me that these critically important risks and their interrelationship with poverty have not yet become truly integral to our thinking. When these risks are taken fully into account, one thing seems to me absolutely clear. A gated community approach to global poverty simply will not work for affluent countries. Technologies such as those that enable New York financial services companies to perform back-office functions in India also allow foreign-based cyber terrorists to more readily threaten complex financial systems in the United States. And the vastly increased movement of goods and services, and people across borders can lead to increased spread of disease from countries with poor health systems, increased cross-border environmental degradation from countries too poor to adequately address environmental issues, increased illegal immigration and transnational crime, greater risk of terrorism that can more readily and more destructively reach across borders, and greater risk of political instability elsewhere that can affect us. Poverty in developing countries is an urgent and massive issue with respect to our way of life and to our economic potential and our national security. As to the best policy path forward in the face of all this complexity, I believe that the debate between the globalists and the anti-globalists is simply the wrong framing of the issue. In some sense, each is wrong and each is right. President Clinton used to say in a domestic context that a strong economy was the best social program, and that seems to me overwhelmingly so in the global context as well. However, he also used to say that a strong economy was only part of what was needed to overcome poverty and what was needed to effectively promote broad-based sharing of growth, and that too applies to the global arena. In effect, a parallel agenda to globalization is needed to address a whole range of purposes, such as education for all, health care for the poor, a reasonable social safety net, and redeployment programs for those dislocated by change, and markets by their nature will not adequately address those needs. That dual program, globalization and the parallel agenda, would both promote global growth and promote poverty reduction and broad-based sharing of growth. That is in part because of the substantive impact of the policies, and in part because the parallel agenda could help foster an understanding by the great preponderance of people that a policy agenda that includes trade liberalization and market-based economics is in their interest. And only with that belief, at least in my view, will those policies have long-term political viability. Unfortunately, the politics of accomplishing both sides of the equation of global trade, capital markets integration, and market-based economics on the one hand, and the parallel agenda on the other hand, are very difficult. And as I learned during my 6.5 years in Washington, the politics are as important as the policy, because if the politics aren't successful, policymakers' decisions, even if outstanding, will never be put in place. The industrial nations are still subject to intense protectionist political pressure, especially in goods like agriculture and textiles that are so important to emerging market countries. And the industrial countries still do not have broad-based understanding of their imperative self-interest in combating poverty, the understanding that is requisite to having adequate foreign assistance. I've touched on the economic aspect of this self-interest in combating poverty. In addition, national security, while requiring a strong military and a willingness to use it, also requires foreign assistance and support in building a social and security infrastructure, or so-called nation building, that gives people hope and a good prospect for political, economic, and social systems that will work for them over time. The recent United Nations Monterey Conference on Global Poverty catalyzed some real progress. But the United States, even if the most recent pledge is fulfilled, will still only be contributing something less than 0.15% of our gross domestic product to foreign assistance, compared to 0.35% for the European Union. And total aid will still fall far short of what is needed to make adequate progress in combating poverty. I personally believe that, at least in the United States, changing the politics of foreign assistance would benefit immensely from, and may even require, a privately financed, massive, multi-year, ongoing public education campaign similar to those against drugs and smoking, to educate the American people about the impacts, actual and potential, of global poverty on us. The Marshall Plan consumed 2% of American GDP for some time to deal with what I think was a somewhat similar threat. But there isn't any energy that is comparable to today's imperative to combat poverty. I remember an important member of the House of Representatives saying to me when I was secretary and I'd gone up to argue for increased assistance, or increased contributions rather, to the World Bank, that voting for foreign assistance would generate a whole host of criticism from constituents in his district, while a vote against foreign assistance would produce no adverse constituent response. And that, in my view, in large measure, captures the political reality in the United States today with respect to foreign assistance, September 11th notwithstanding. And that brings us to the question of the effectiveness of aid, which is obviously a key issue, both substantively and as to the politics of aid. Based on all that I saw and learned when I was secretary, and this was a subject that I focused intensely upon at that time, and since then, I do believe that while much could be done to improve effectiveness, the evidence of positive impact is more than adequate to warrant enormously increased foreign assistance as work continues on that improvement. For example, river blindness has been largely eliminated because of drugs donated by one manufacturer and a single individual donor who contributed the funds to distribute those drugs. Countries in Southeast and Northern Asia have had remarkable growth in poverty reduction over several decades. Korea, for example, went from a GDP per capita of under $100 several decades ago to roughly $9,000 per capita today. And that was not solely a function of Korea's policies and practices, though those certainly were constructive. Korea received an immense infusion of aid, something over 10% of Korean GDP at one point, after the Korean War. India has grown an average of 5.5% per year for the last 15 years, and China has had high rates of growth and greatly reduced poverty over the past 20 years. And as President Bush said a few weeks ago, Bangladesh, Mozambique, and Uganda are more recent examples of progress in combating poverty and generating growth. Having said that, we all know the data. Roughly half the world's population lives on under $2 a day, and roughly 20% lives on under $1 a day. Many countries have made little progress, and some have retrogressed. And even in some countries that have grown, far too little of that growth has benefited the poor, for example, Brazil and Mexico. Long-standing conventional wisdom is that aid to be effective must be combined with good policies and practices in recipient countries. As a consequence of that view, aid has in most cases, for many years, been conditioned on good policy. And in my view, that focus should be especially on effective governance and relative freedom from corruption. On one level, that makes absolute sense. However, that practice of conditionality also means that impoverished populations in many countries will be relegated to continued unaided misery because of the actions of leaders and governments over which they have no control. And that includes quite a number of countries where political instability or an environment conducive to terrorism could affect us. I don't know the answer to this quandary, but the response to poverty in ill-governed countries or failed states needs, in my judgment, far more intense and thoughtful consideration. Assistance administered through non-governmental organizations, NGOs, is one approach, but that too can have problems. I had a meeting recently with a finance minister of a well-governed but very poor country who said that the proliferation of uncoordinated NGOs in his country had become a nightmare. Another approach is to find better ways of influencing corrupt and ineffective governments, as through industrial country ostracism of their leaders, denial of access by those leaders to industrial country financial systems, and the like. Let me conclude with both darkness and light. On the dark side, I believe, as I said a bit ago, that a gated community approach to poverty simply cannot work for the industrial nations, including the United States. and that global poverty in a world so tightly interconnected will increasingly impose itself upon us and change our way of life in many and profound ways. If, on the other hand, we meet our challenges, especially in combating poverty and promoting broad-based sharing of growth, then the future of the global economy seems to me to offer great potential. Firstly, the risk of political instability and terrorism would be very materially reduced, and secondly, the likelihood would have increased for continued reduction in economic barriers between countries, continued movement toward market-based economics, and an environment conducive to technological and scientific advance. I don't think there is any way to gauge whether the future is more likely to tend toward the light or toward the dark. But I do think that we may well be at an historically important junction point between political and social disruption, including possible use of weapons of mass destruction, on the one hand, or increasing and more widely shared economic well-being and greatly enhanced security, on the other hand. In that context, I think that open-minded intellectual inquiry and analysis that recognizes the immense complexities, uncertainties, and ambiguities involved in these issues can greatly increase the likelihood of a better outcome. Having said that, policymakers can make good decisions, and editorial writers can opine until they are blue in the face. And that will almost surely produce results far short of the goal without an effective political strategy grounded in public understanding of the imperative of combating poverty to the industrial nations. At core, vastly increased public understanding is needed to create a political mandate for foreign assistance and nation building as components of a full program, including trade liberalization and market-based economics. Harvard University, with its immense standing, can serve a great public purpose by providing leadership, as by this colloquium, in spurring inquiry, debate, and public discourse on these critical matters at a time when so much could be at stake. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We're ready for some questions from the floor. I had not planned to take the moderator's privilege of the first question, but after Bob's remarks about how he had the microphone and his
I didn't realize how this was organized.
and his gentle and supportive comments about my service as Deputy Secretary, I thought I would change my mind. Bob, everyone shares the judgment that recent events in Argentina are tragic. Some see this as the neoliberal, technocratic strategy coming to its inevitable and painful end. Others see Argentina's problems as rooted in a failure to adopt market forces in a sufficiently vigorous way in terms of its fiscal institutions, in terms of the regulations that govern its markets, and conclude that Argentina's problem was not too much globalization in markets, but too little. Since that event is recent enough to be on people's minds, do you want to comment on the Argentine experience?
It's like debates we used to have when I was at Treasury. We'd all sit around and discuss these things. Yeah, I'll tell you what I think, Larry. I think that, and you and I discussed this over a long period of time, I think that Argentina had a set of fiscal policies that were not well geared toward their exchange. Well, I think two things. One, had fiscal policies that were basically unsound, particularly in the ability of the provincial governments to spend money pretty much without control. And secondly, they had, as you know, a fixed exchange rate. And I think one of the lessons of the last decade, the 1990s, is that fixed exchange rates carry with them enormous risks. But if you're going to have a fixed exchange rate, and in my judgment at least, they're almost always not a very good idea, but although in some circumstances it may be a good idea, but if you're going to have one, then you must surely have a fiscal policy and a monetary policy that are sound and are commensurate with your fixed exchange rate policy. They had neither the sound fiscal policy that they should have had on the one hand, and on the other hand, a flexible exchange rate policy which might have compensated in some measure for the fiscal policies. And so I think this was a failure of policy and is not at all relevant to the question of whether the model of market-based economics and global integration makes sense.
Why don't we go back and forth taking questions?
Should I call on people? Or do you want?
Just back and forth.
I'm sorry, I didn't see the
This
mics.
mic first.
Okay.
Hi.
Yes,
My
ma'am.
name is Noemi Gishpence, and it was very refreshing to hear about how you learned on the job while you were Secretary of Treasury. And
Yeah, well, some people think I didn't learn, but in any event, that was my view of the case.
well, learning happens when something unexpected happens, when you had one view and something that you weren't expecting came up. So I was wondering if you could comment on something that happened while you were Secretary, and also if you could relate it to some of what you commented on today, that one prong of globalization is capital market integration. And as you know, in 97, 98, and you commented briefly on this, there was a financial crisis in East Asia. And I was wondering if that came as a surprise, and if it did, what did you learn from it?
Did it come as a surprise? I don't think it came as a surprise that there would be periodic, and I believe, by the way, in the future there will be periodic crises in capital markets. I think on balance, the integration of global capital markets has contributed very substantially to economic well-being in many parts of the world, but I do think it has created an increased risk of periodic crises, and I think real changes have been made that will reduce the probability of those crises occurring, and hopefully the severity of them, and also will improve response. But I do think they will be a reality of a system of open capital markets. Did the 97, 98 so-called Asian financial crisis come as a surprise? When it started in Thailand, we recognized the possibility that you could have contagion. By the way, a recognition that was manifest in Mexico as well when we dealt with the Mexican crisis. One of the points we made in dealing with the Mexican crisis was that these kinds of crises can create contagion. I would have said at the beginning of the Thailand crisis that while it was very important to deal with it because of the risk of contagion and also because of Thailand, that the probability of a contagion seemed to me to be relatively low. It's not that we didn't recognize it, we recognized it. We thought the probability, I at least thought the probability was relatively low. But it didn't take very long to begin to see that this was spreading all over, or not all over, but it spread to many other countries. And I think the international community dealt with it with a strength and with a force that, number one, worked, was effective in the countries that took ownership of good policy, and number two, I believe at least, avoided what was a risk of a crisis, an economic set of circumstances that might have been disruptive across the globe, including to the United States. In terms of what you learned from it, let me do it very briefly. I do think that one of the conclusions we drew was that fixed rate exchange systems probably are not wise except in unusual circumstances where they're backed by appropriate policy. I at least concluded that the more private sector burden sharing you can get into the response, the better, because of the effect that will have as a so-called moral hazard issue. That is to say, by make it painful for people to have invested, then presumably they'll be more careful next time they invest. And that's based on the view that I had, that part of the, or I think many of us had, that part of the problem was in the policy regimes in many emerging market countries. Part of it was an excess flow of capital. And I think one of the lessons we should have learned is that what happens in the rest of the world in all kinds of ways can affect us, and that our self-interest enormously lies in providing leadership and engaging with financial crisis as well as with geopolitical issues and with global poverty.
Bob, Graham Allison. How are you?
Oh, hi, Graham. How are you?
Good. I like the thrust of your remarks very much, but I want to get you to drill down a little more on one of the topics for the symposium, namely the linkages between poverty on the one hand and terrorism on the other. As you asserted the linkage, but didn't offer much of the knitting. If I look at the terrorist acts against the U.S. recently, Mr. bin Laden is certainly not suffering from poverty. The folks who were the hijackers were not generally poor. So that is not, at least it's not enough of an explanation. And similarly, if I look at the poverty reduction or the income distribution agenda, I am in favor of it for lots of reasons, moral and other, but I don't see how it's having a very substantial impact on terrorism or WMD terrorism.
You know, you're right, Graham. My recollection is that the terrorists on September 11th were predominantly middle-income and or probably upper-middle-income people. But I can't give you evidence of the kind that at a law school they would consider sufficient. Of course, law school, anything's sufficient. It's just a question whether you can make the argument. But, it occurred to me that's hardly the standard you want to set. But I can't give you evidence of it. But this is an instinct I've had for a long, or feeling I've had for a long time. When I left Treasury in July of '99, and about September of '99, the London School of Economics, I went over and gave a speech at London School of Economics, and I talked some of which I'm talking about right now. And one of the things I said was that one of the things that most struck me when I was secretary is when I went around the world to emerging market countries, this immense poverty seemed to me to be a terrible threat to us, and in exactly the ways I've just described. I agree with you. The people who participated, at least in September 11th, largely or wholly people who come from a different economic strata. But I still think, Graham, that it's these kind of conditions of hopelessness and resentment and anger that create the environment in which terrorism can be bred and in which terrorists can operate. And though I can't give you proof in the sense that you're talking about it, in the sense of drilling down, and I don't know if such proof, in fact, could exist, there's no question in my mind that alienation, resentment, and hopelessness are a threat to us in that respect.
Hi, Secretary Rubin. My name's Owen Ogier. I'm with the International Consortium for a Sustainable Future. We're actually working on the program of public education that you describe, or at least our small version of it. My question has to do with something that you mentioned. You said that the market forces, free market forces, are inherently unable to be good stewards of the environment and of social causes. Although they are beneficial to social causes, they are not the complete picture, and you spoke of a parallel agenda. My question for you is, what international, domestic, or other institutions are required in order to support that parallel agenda worldwide?
Well, I think you raise a very interesting question. I didn't get to talk about this in my remarks, but my personal view, for whatever it's worth, is that we don't have adequate institutions right now to deal with the kinds of transnational issues that we face. The Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, were created after the Second World War. The UN was created very shortly after the Second World War to deal with the issues of that era. In a world in which rainforests that get destroyed in Brazil can affect the global warming and the environment that we live in, I personally think we need a new, we either have to strengthen and increase the functionality of the existing institutions or create new institutions. But I don't think that's actually the real problem. I think the real problem is we live in a nation of sovereign states, and yet the problems are transnational. And so how do we create effective functionality at a transnational level? And I don't have great wisdom on that, other than to say that I think it's imperatively important for us to do it. Well, I guess I do have a view. I think it's only going to happen when the people in the industrial countries, because I think that's where the issue lies, understand their self-interest in doing this. With respect to global warming, which I suspect is one issue that you feel strongly about, there seems to be that understanding across the globe, except here. But in the world that we live in, it's here that matters most in terms of what happens.
Thank you.
I don't know if that's responsive or not, but I truly believe that that education and understanding are the only way these things are going to happen in the world that we live in. Oh, somebody up there. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, I'm also from the same international consortium. My name is Avery Willett, and I want to take you back to looking at decision-making structures. So I've noticed that most decisions are made based on power, and there have been studies to show that decisions are more influenced by money than they are by time, and thus that leads me to believe why market-based economies and globalization has taken more precedence over issues of poverty and environment. So how can we change our decision-making structures so that poverty and environmental degradation have more of a priority? And also, how do we include more perspectives in these decision-making structures so that they do reflect the people that are at the bottom level?
I'm sorry, I misheard one thing you said. You said more by money than time?
Right.
What do you mean by time?
Time meaning doing the advocacy work, lobbying,
Oh, okay, I got
that
it.
type of thing.
I got it. Well, I expressed my view in my remarks. I don't think that it is likely that you're going to get the policy priorities that you think we should have, and I think I'd be inclined to agree with you. Well, I do think globalization, integration of capital markets, integration of trade, market-based economics have been enormous forces for good economically, but I also think, as I said in my remarks, that markets by their nature are not going to address a whole host of issues fully or adequately, and therefore you need other policies to go with it. But I don't think you're going to get the priorities that you want or the focus that you want on those issues, the environment, global poverty, and the rest, unless people who serve in political office feel that's in their political interest, and they sure don't feel it now. So I'll go back to something I said. I think that somehow or other the American mindset needs to be changed, and I at least think that the most likely way to change that is through some group of individuals, foundations, or others funding some kind of truly massive public education campaign. If there is another answer, I don't know what it would be.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I have another question on institutions, but keeping it much more economics. I think we talked about the Marshall Plan, and I think the key difference there, of course, is that the countries concerned actually had been developed. I mean, so it's didn't that they have to learn how to get developed from, they didn't have to bootstrap themselves without knowing how to do it. And so the question now, I mean, given we have maybe 100, 120 countries for which we need to figure out how to do this, is what do we know, I mean, about institutions? Like, I mean, that, and how are we going to think about these nation-building things? Because I don't think anyone has a clue. And the related question is also the fact that I think history tells us that institutional change is never a small incremental process. I mean, I think almost all the times we see significant institutional change, it's a discrete thing. And what that means is that magnifies the uncertainty in the short term. I mean, when you're looking at, let's say, converting a regime in Saudi Arabia to a democratic regime, which we know is probably good in the long term, but nobody wants to touch something like that in the short term because it's just completely explosive. So how do we think about issues like that?
Well, we'll leave Saudi Arabia aside for the moment. When you say nobody has a clue, I think I'd be inclined not to agree with that. There actually are a goodly number of countries that over a period of some decades, or in some cases more recently over the last decade or thereabouts, have actually made a great deal of progress in growth. I gave you the Korea example. It's a particularly good example. Singapore was a poor fishing village 40 or 50 years ago, and today it is an enormously prosperous country. So I think there are enough, actually quite a number of examples of countries that have accomplished a great deal economically. And I think one can look at those countries and there are commonalities, focus on education, high savings rates, increased global integration over time, market-based economics, four that come to mind, effective governance, effective government, some reasonable degree of freedom from corruption. I think the problem that to me is most vexing at least is how do you accomplish, or how, put differently, how is growth going to be accomplished in the countries that start, I said in my remarks, that start with ineffective governments or corrupt governments, including some that bear the label of democracy, but in fact serve their people horrendously. And that, I think, is an issue that nobody has figured out. What I at least personally think is wrong is simply to say, well, let me start differently. I do think that conditioning foreign assistance on good policy makes a lot of sense, on the one hand. On the other hand, I think it's wrong to look at the countries that are failed states or have ineffective and corrupt governments and to say we're simply going to let you suffer or wallow in your misery until there is better government. I think it's wrong for all kinds of reasons, not the least of which is those then become arenas in which all the kinds of problems that can affect us can develop. But on the other hand, as I said in my remarks, I don't have a good answer as to how you effectuate change in those countries. Yes, sir. I think we're over.
Oh, thank you. My name is Arnulf Simon. My domain is political economy. And I just have two questions. One introductory question. Is there any way to get you back into present cabinet? Because when you left...
In this government?
IQ left... No, let me finish,
well,
please.
I wrote a 1,200-word op-ed piece in the New York Times opposing last May's tax cuts. So they could have invited me back to have a minority opinion with them, but I didn't get invited.
No. When you left, average IQ dropped by 30 points.
Well, that's probably true in the Treasury Department. Whether it was true spread over the whole government, because a lot of people you have to, you divide by the base and so forth. So I don't know if that really is accurate.
I think that right now it's about freezing point.
Above freezing point.
Well, but...
I liked you. Good, what?
If I can just remark something on 1990. There was a meeting in Zurich, sponsored by KPMG, which was the result of 3 years' effort to address all the issues that you mentioned. What do we do in Central and Eastern Europe to eliminate following 10 years? It was a very thorough, very detailed plan. By the way, Citicorp was part of it. They were chiming. I got them in. And I used Lee and Singapore experience as a jumping stone. Unfortunately, some choleric fellow came with something they called shock therapy.
Who?
Jeffrey Sachs.
Oh.
The whole thing was destroyed. So we have a tremendous...
Are you from Russia?
No, I'm Czech.
You're Czech?
Originally. Now I am American, but I came from there.
No, I've heard.
So, but I would like to get to my question now. We can talk about it after meeting. I can give you some materials. There are ways how to do it. There are ways how to accomplish.
But the question is what?
The question is the following. There are some evildoers, borrowing our glorious, illustrious leader phrase. There are saying, like Ministry of Finance of German Republic, and I have Dr. Pin's report, considering our account balance and trading balance. They are stating that by about 2005, we will be effectively bankrupt.
Who will be?
The
United States?
United States, because of the tremendous imbalance.
But the question is what?
Now, I think that as a consequence of what is happening now in the Middle East, Europeans...
Yeah, but could I suggest you...
Just a second. There will be a question. It's narrowing.
Yeah, but there shouldn't be a speech before the question.
Okay. I think that euro would become a settlement currency for purchases of oil, which means the dollar will be no longer needed.
Well,
What effect it will have on our economy if that happens?
if the dollar is no longer needed, that would be adverse. Yeah. I actually think... I wouldn't jump to the conclusion you jumped to, though. It's very interesting. With our current account deficit over 4% of GDP,
Right.
capital is still flowing into this country. Returns on capital in this country still exceed returns elsewhere. Japan is not at the present moment considered an enormously terrific place to invest.
Saudi are taking money out and have been taking since January.
That may be, but on balance, there have been big inflows in the capital account. Europe, because of structural, at least in my view, because of inadequate reform, labor law reforms and various other reforms, failure to deal with structural reform, is still considered by most, I think, to have a considerably lower full capacity, full employment rate of growth in the United States. So I think for all kinds of reasons, this is going to continue to be, for a long time to come, a place that people with capital will want to invest. And if that's so, that will be supportive with respect to the dollar. I'm not suggesting the dollar don't have a view on the dollar. I'm not making any prediction or judgment of what the dollar will do. All I'm saying is that I think there will be substantial demand for it for the reasons I just said.
I would say 2 years, no more than
2 years? Okay.
Two things. Just to check, Bob, you still do believe that a strong dollar is in the national interest?
Strong dollars. Is that what you used to say? Yeah, strong dollars. Yeah, I actually do.
Two more questions.
Okay.
Time for two more questions.
Hi, I'm from Brazil, and I'm very pleased to be here and participate in this brilliant colloquium, and congratulations to all of you. We share the vision that the Internet is the most wonderful tool ever created to integrate and even to decrease the distance and the gap between rich and poor. Then comes the issue of IPR, intellectual property rights. How do you see, if you see any condition for developed countries?
For what?
The developed countries to be engaged in the digital era, concerning that, let's say, everything in those countries are much, much cheaper than US, besides the softwares that are cost twice as much as United States. Once you have, the per capita gross product of these countries, 10, 20 times less than the United States. Don't you think, there is a need for another policy concerning to those countries to try to put them in the market and then enhance the whole business?
Two comments, if I may. This is not an area I have any expertise in, but one, I think the Internet and information technology and things developments over the last few years have contributed greatly to productivity increase. I wouldn't say they're the greatest thing ever. There's electricity, there's running water. There are a lot. There was the crossbow in its day, which was quite a force, actually, in geopolitics. Intellectual property rights are a tough question. I guess that I was in China a couple of weeks, it was 3, 4 weeks ago, I don't remember when exactly. It seemed to me that there was extensive use, at least in the Beijing, Shanghai part of China, not obviously the West and the areas that are so deeply troubled. So I don't think intellectual property, it's funny, you may be right about what you said, but I haven't heard people say that intellectual property rights have been a major problem with respect to Internet and information technology in emerging market countries. Obviously, that's an enormous issue with respect to drugs, and that's a question that's been much debated and so forth. I guess my own view, for whatever it's worth, is that if we don't protect intellectual property rights, then we're not going to have intellectual property, because it's not going to make sense to develop it. On the other hand, there also has to be some reasonable basis for emerging market countries to get access to that intellectual property. If it's a problem in the software area, that was not something I was aware of. In the drug area, it obviously is a problem. And I personally thought in the drug area, the best answer to that probably lay somewhat in recognizing intellectual property, because I do think otherwise we won't have it, but in the industrial countries creating a pool of some sort that would enable the emerging market countries to benefit from that property.
I have one question. Globalization seems like a tendency. It will be an ongoing tendency for a while, 21st century, due to the capitalism, the nature of the capitalism, and also due to the advancement of technology. But the problem of how can we maintain and sustain the globalization without exploitation of the haves to the not have, does not have. And also another, the issue of exploitation and free exchange, equal exchange. Another question is, you mentioned and you exemplified a Korean case, but Korea is two countries right now, South Korea and North Korea. What do you mention? I don't think you mentioned about North Korea. It is South Korea, right? Korea is two nations at this moment, but you use the word Korea. Because I'm from South Korea, I want to know what you mentioned.
Oh, when I talked about a Korea that has $9,000 per capita GDP, I surely was talking about South Korea.
It's South Korea. But there is another country, North Korea.
There is most certainly another country.
Yes, thank you.
No, I was talking about the Republic of Korea.
Yeah.
On your first question, it was sort of the point, I guess it was what I was trying to discuss in my remarks. I think that the answer to the haves and have-nots is something along the lines that the Zedillo Commission recommended. The United States, I may have this slightly wrong, but I think the total foreign assistance today is somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 billion per annum. I may be slightly off, but I think I'm in the right area. And what the Zedillo report recommended was that should be doubled on a per annum basis. Was that number right, or is it something somewhat different? I don't know, but I was a member of that commission. I sat in the meetings. It seemed to me that if the industrial countries doubled, roughly speaking, doubled what they provide in foreign assistance, number one. Number two, if they open their markets to the goods that are most important to the emerging market countries. And number three, if we find ways to deal, more effective ways to deal with this quandary of the ill-governed states, the ineffectively governed states, the corrupt states, and the failed states, I think it's that combination. Obviously, all of that directed at as well at encouraging and promoting strong policy, effective policy within emerging market countries. I think that's the package that works, but to say it is easy, to do it is hard.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you especially, Bob, for your inspiring thoughts, and we shall all remember your call at the conclusion of your remarks for Harvard University to redouble its efforts to be a center of thought on the enormously important problems that you have discussed with us. Thank you very much, Bob Rubin.